Hello everybody, this is RWS Studios and welcome to today's video, which, as you may have already guessed, isn't an ordinary one. A while ago I said I would remake my History of Sodor videos, and I still intend to do so. I had originally intended to release them back in May and June to mark the RWS Theories' 80th anniversary, but I was delayed. I then planned to release them a couple of weeks ago, but I'm afraid I've been delayed again, which is why I released my Thunderbirds videos instead. I can assure you that the updated History of Sodor videos are coming, but as to when exactly that might be, I can't really say at the moment. I'm sure that by the end of this video you will understand why it's taken me so long to make them. You see, when I made the original videos, I didn't really put that much thought into them, and many of you have pointed out just how obvious that was. This time I want to do everything properly, and that is the main purpose of this video, to show you how far I've come, give you an idea of what I've still got to do, and also where you might be able to help out. There are plenty of ways you can get involved. If you have any ideas as we go through, then feel free to leave them in the comments below. You can also send them to the email in the description. I do believe that I have a good idea for all the characters for all the various railways on Sodor, but I do feel like something is missing. So I'd like to open it up to all my viewers to come up with and create their own character. Now, this can be for any railway you like. It can be for the North Western Railway, or the Skarloey Railway, the Arlesdale Railway, the Coltefell Railway, the former Mid-Sodor Railway, or even a railway on the mainland. It doesn't even have to be an engine. It could be a car, a lorry, a bus, a boat, a human, even an animal if you really want to. All you need to do is provide a name, a real-life basis, so if this is a vehicle, a real-life vehicle or class or something of that nature. If this is an animal, then a species, and a backstory, or any additional information and illustrations you think I might need. Send your ideas to the email, which you will find in the description below. I will choose at least one, maybe more, of his characters to appear in my series. Now, if you look in the description, you can also see a link for where you can vote on some of the things I will be talking about in this video, and I will explain them properly at the relevant points. Before we get started though, there is one more thing I do want to mention. When I made the original videos, I received a few comments criticizing me for diverting too far from the established lore and effectively creating my own headcanon. I want to try and avoid that this time around, as this is meant to be a theory, not a separate headcanon. Therefore, I should probably go ahead and explain the difference between a theory and a headcanon. To start with, a canon consists of all of a franchise's officially confirmed lore. So, for example, any facts or details publicly released by Wilbert Awdry, his son Christopher, or his grandson Richard are considered official Railway Series lore and are therefore considered canon. A headcanon is a personal interpretation of a franchise which usually includes characters or stories that contradict the established canon. So, for example, if the Railway Series is the official canon, then the classic era of Thomas and Friends would be Britt Allcroft's headcanon, and the Brenner era would be Andrew Brenner's headcanon. Of course, this would mean that the Magic Railroad is a headcanon of a headcanon, however that works. Meanwhile, a theory is also a fan creation, but crucially, a theory doesn't affect or contradict the official canon, and more often than not, it's based on evidence found within the canon. An example of a theory would be Smudger and Bertram. In Thomas and Friends, Smudger was a troublesome engine that used to work on Duke's old railway. Of course, the manager soon got fed up with Smudger derailing all the time and had him rebuilt into a generator. Years later, we're introduced to an engine called Bertram, which is actually just Duke's model repainted and given Smudger's face. This has led to the theory that Smudger was recovered from Duke's old shed and rebuilt once or even twice, and also being renamed Bertram. Now, this has never been confirmed, but it doesn't affect the TV series canon in any way, and therefore it will be considered a theory. Now, not everything I'm going to mention will actually have a reference from the established railway series canon, but the main purpose is to make sure it doesn't contradict the canon in any way. So with that out of the way, it's time to get started. So, all aboard, sit back, and enjoy the ride. Now in this video I'm mainly going to be looking at the Northwestern Railway, as the other railways there aren't actually that many theories to look at. But with the Northwestern Railway there's actually quite a few. But before we can look at the Northwestern Railway, we do need to look at its predecessors. The Tidmouth, Knapford and Ellsbridge Light Railway, the Wellsworth and Sudbury Railway, and the Sodor and Mainland Railway. Since it's by far the oldest, let's start with the Sodor and Mainland Railway. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the confirmed lore and build it up from there. So what do we know about the Sodor and Mainland Railway? Well, almost nothing. Reverend Audrey has stated that the Sodor and Mainland Railway were terrible at record keeping, so hardly anything is known about the railway or its engines. This effectively gives us a blank slate to work with. That doesn't mean there aren't any details at all though. At least 3 Nielsen box tanks have been confirmed to have worked on the Sodor and Mainland Railway at some point. There's also a debate as to whether or not there was a 4th engine. We know that the railway's number 2 was called Neil, as Skarloey has mentioned him several times when referring to the early days of the Skarloey Railway, particularly in the book Very Old Engines. But it is unknown what the other engines were named, or even if they had names at all, and it seems like no one can agree on the names of the railway's numbers 1 and 3. I've seen several names being suggested, including Roger, Clive, Matthew, Steele, Emile, Drongo, and Mongo. And then of course we have number 4. We don't even know if number 4 existed. It could just be a legend created through rumour and hearsay. In universe there are 2 possible explanations for number 4. 1. Number 4 is just that, a rumour started by people to explain the inconsistencies of the railway's history. Or 2. Number 4 did actually exist, but due to a lack of records, their existence cannot be definitively proven. Now, it has been confirmed that the majority of the engines on Sodor prior to the construction of the Northwestern Railway were eventually scrapped, most likely before Percy arrived in 1926, but it has been confirmed that Neil somehow survived scrapping. So chances are that Neil would have told someone all about the Sodor and Mainland Railway at some point, and surely his stories would eventually reach one of the fat controllers that used to run the Northwestern Railway. The fat controller in turn would likely tell Reverend Audrey. However, none of this has happened, which means Neil didn't tell anybody about number 4. This is either because 1. Number 4 didn't exist, or 2. Number 4 was such a terrible engine that Neil didn't want to remember them. I feel the latter is probably more likely. Now it's not just numbers 1 and 3 that need a name, number 4 needs a name as well. I've already given you some of the names suggested for number 1 and number 3, but number 4 I feel would be a bit different. Thinking about it, a name like Drongo or Mongo would actually be quite fitting for number 4. These both mean idiot or fool. Given that Neil has no fond memories of number 4, this does seem fitting. However, neither of these terms were coined until the 1950s, a whole century after the box tanks were built. An old-fashioned name with a similar meaning is clodpate, but to me that just doesn't sound quite right. Alternatively, we could use a Sudric name. That's actually a bit difficult to do because there isn't an English to Sudric translator. But Reverend Audrey has stated Sudric is almost identical to Manx, the language they used to speak on the Isle of Man. So all we have to do is get our chosen phrase translated into Manx, and then alter it slightly to make it appear more Sudric. By doing this, the English phrase great fool loosely translates into the Manx phrase Dunan Muir, which, to make it seem more Sudric, could be changed slightly to Dunin Muir. Now these of course are just suggestions. I still haven't decided what I'm going to use for the names for numbers 1, 3 and 4. So this is the first part where you can get involved. As I said earlier, there are some things you can vote on, and the first of all is of course voting on the names for Sodor and Mainland number 1, number 3 and number 4. Whilst on the subject of the Sodor and Mainland Railway, there is one other thing that needs to be mentioned, and that is, according to Reverend Audrey, at least one of these box tanks was scrapped in 1901, and at least 2 of the other engines were sold off. We know Neil was definitely sold to the Crotonsgate Mining Company. That just leaves numbers 1, 3 and 4. Logically, number 4 is the most likely of the engines to be scrapped, which could be another reason why Neil never talked about him. And that means at least one of either number 1 or number 3 was sold, possibly both. Although it's also possible that one of them was left behind in the shed. Wouldn't be the first time something's happened like that in this series. Actually, scratch that, this is 1901. If one of the engines was left behind in the shed, it would be the first time in the series that has been done. So next up is the Wellsworth and Sudbury Railway. This is the railway where the fandom seems to deviate the most from the established lore. Many creators have suggested that the Wellsworth and Sudbury Railway was run by a Peckett saddle tank called Colin, a London South Western Railway O2 called Lily, and an Adams radial tank engine called Adam. This is most likely inspired by the trains models created by Wild Nor'Wester for his series Sodor the Early Years and Sodor the Modern Years. For those of you who've seen the original videos, you will know that I'd like this idea very much. However, it does contradict the known lore, so I will have to scrap that idea and begin again. So what do we know about the Wellsworth and Sudbury engines? Well, we know that they are all 060 tank engines. Number 1 and number 2 were both built by Manning Wardle in 1870. Number 3 was a tank engine built by Sharp, Stewart and Company, but was later rebuilt into a tender engine. Meanwhile, number 4 is a blank slate. We know that they are an 060 tank engine, and that's about it. Going back to numbers 1 and 2, Reverend Audrey said in one of his lectures that they were Manning Wardle Q-class tank engines. The only problem is, number 1 and number 2 arrived on the railway when it opened in 1870, but Manning Wardle didn't start building the Q-class until 3 years later. So chances are number 1 and number 2 are the old I class, the K class, or the M class. Although it doesn't really matter too much, for the sake of argument I'm just going to pick the K class, although I could easily pick one of the other two, there's not really that much in it. I'm also going to carry over the names Colin and Lily as well as their personalities, because I do think they work quite well. So, on to number 3 then. Number 3 was an 060 tank engine built by Sharp, Stewart and Company. Because of this, I've called the engine Stewart. Now, I know this might cause confusion with the narrow gauge engine called Stewart, but Stewart was later renamed to Peter Sam. Besides, it's not uncommon to have more than one character with the same name. I mean, take the name Bert, for instance. Albert is the name of the first chairman of the North Western Railway. There were up to 3 engines on the Mid-Sodor Railway named Albert. There was a standard gauge engine on the mainland called Albert. There is a bus called Bertie. And there is a miniature engine called Bert, as well as a porter and a cleaner that are also both called Bert. And that's just in the railway series. In the TV series, there's also a narrow gauge engine called Bertram, a diesel shunter named Bert, and a workman called Albert. So that's 12 different characters with a variation of the name Bert. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. So we've covered number 1, number 2 and number 3, so that just leaves number 4. Now, to be honest, I have absolutely no idea what to do with number 4, because I don't actually know very much about 19th century locomotives. Luckily though, I didn't have to come up with a basis. You see, whilst I was looking for suitable images for numbers 1, 2 and 3, I came across some railway series style images created by Rexeljet, including an image for Wordsworth and Sudbury number 4. Rexeljet has suggested that number 4 could be the same kind of engine as number 2309 Haydock, built by Robin Stevenson and Company. Well, it's an 060, so that fits the law, and we don't know anything at all that contradicts this. So Betty, as Rexeljet has called them, would make the ideal number 4. Next up, we have the coffee pots. The most common idea I've seen is to basically copy the character of Glyn from the TV series. The only problem with that is Glyn looks like this. And this is what the coffee pots look like in the railway series. Apart from number 1, which actually looked a bit like this, before being built to look a bit more like this. So, despite what I said in an earlier video, Glyn can be ruled out immediately. Like the box tanks, we know exactly what the coffee pots are, just not their names. Now, Rexeljet has also done illustrations of the 4 coffee pot engines, and he's given them names: Minnie, Roger, Beryl and Danny. I like those names, so I'm going to stick with them. But what I do want to try and do is explain why those names were chosen. Given that the original Fat Controller, Sir Topham Hatt, actually built the coffee pot engines himself, chances are he is the one who named them. Now, we know the name of Sir Topham Hatt's wife, and his children, and his grandchildren, and his great-grandchildren. But we don't know the names of Topham's parents or siblings, assuming he has any, which again gives us a blank slate. I like to think that Topham was part of a large family with many siblings, and that he named the coffee pot engines after his brothers and sisters. That's the theory I'm going to work with for the time being, and we'll have another look at the Hatt family later. In 1912, the Wellsworth and Sudbury Railway wanted to use Tidmouth Harbour because Sudbury and Brendam had both been disasters in terms of their harbours. When extending their line up as far as Knapford, they were merged with the Tidmouth, Knapford and Ellsbridge Light Railway to become the Tidmouth, Wellsworth and Sudbury Railway. The general belief amongst fans is that following this merger, the Tidmouth, Wellsworth and Sudbury Railway made plans to extend their main line east to Marron and then to build a viaduct to Cronk. Naturally, the former Wellsworth and Sudbury tank engines would not have been capable of running such a long main line and what was now the Brendam branch line by themselves. They were definitely going to need more engines. The Austerity family have never stated whether or not the Tidmouth, Wellsworth and Sudbury Railway acquired any more engines prior to the First World War, or what these engines might have been. Given that the railway consists of 3 lines and has a relatively long main line, I doubt 4 small tank engines and a couple of toffee pots would be sufficient. Now, as it happens, I already have a theory about this which I can actually carry over from my original video. My theory is that the railway acquired 2 044 tank engines that ran the main services on the main line, and an 040 saddle tank to shunt in the yard. Then the former Wellsworth and Sudbury engines would run secondary services on the main line and would primarily run the Brendam branch. As for the new engines, I have specifically chosen a London South Western Railway M7 called Jackson, a Caledonian Railway 439 class called Alistair, and a Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway Class 21 called Wallace. These engines would have arrived in 1912 or possibly 1913 on a long-term loan. These loans would have been in place for several years, and therefore would have been inherited by the North Western Railway. So these engines would have stayed on Sodor until at least the end of the First World War, after which they would have returned to their old railways, resulting in the locomotive crisis of the 1920s. Now, nobody has disputed my theory for the other Tidmouth, Wellsworth and Sudbury engines, but what has been disputed is the other engine that they acquired, Timothy. We all know the story of Timothy. He was a prototype for the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway E2, the same class as Thomas. Timothy was a kind and hard-working engine who suffered a nervous breakdown when the railway decided to scrap him, and so he drove off the incomplete viaduct and plunged into the ravine below. Allegedly, this is what Percy used as inspiration for his ghost story. However, the exact details of this incident are heavily debated. Some say only Timothy died. Others say that his crew were unable to uncouple the coaches and everybody died. And some have even claimed that he was possessed by something out of the supernatural. Yeah, right. Now, I'd argue that since the guard has their own brakes within their coach, that the guard should have been able to slow the train, if not stop it entirely. Therefore, I think it's safe to assume the guard and the passengers survived. But if Timothy was destroyed, then chances are at least one member of his footplate crew died in the accident alongside him, most likely his driver. The only flaw with this theory is explaining how the crew would have been able to uncouple the coaches, as you can't just uncouple coaches from a moving train. Well, you can in America, but you certainly can't in Britain, for we use the hook and chain system. I was able to come up with an explanation, however. Regardless what version of events you believe in, the general theory is that after the event, The investigation blamed the accident on poor maintenance of Timothy's brakes. This implies that there were other areas of the railway which were suffering from a lack of maintenance. One of these could very easily be the couplings, which might have been weak enough that the fireman could break them with his shovel. I admit it's a bit of a stretch, but if the maintenance really was that bad, it's not that big of a stretch. Okay, now we're finally going to look at engines that used to work on the North Western Railway. And we're going to start with looking at an engine from the First World War. A theory I have seen is that alongside Thomas, Edward, and all the engines I've mentioned so far, there was another engine on Sodor during the First World War. This engine did not have a name, but it did have a number, 260. The theory goes that 260 was an 040 tank engine belonging to the War Department and was used to move munitions around. But one night 260 was too rough with his trucks and was blown up as a result. Now, there is a flaw with this theory in that during the First World War, the War Department didn't actually own that many engines. Most engines used for military applications during the First World War actually came under what was called the Railway Operating Division, or ROD for short. The theory that 260 was actually an ROD engine works quite well, as the ROD did acquire a number of older tank engines for various different duties. And as it happens, the number 260 was not assigned until 1917. So it's possible that 260 was given to another engine, who arrived on Sodor in 1914 or 1915, was blown up by 1916, and leaving the number vacant to be reassigned to another engine in 1917. Right. Now we can move on to some engines that have actually appeared in the books, starting with the 3 railway engines. This book was originally illustrated by William Middleton, but since C. Reginald Dalby has re-illustrated the book, it's probably safe to say that the engine's appearances in Middleton's original illustrations are non-canon. So we will be working with Dalby's illustrations to identify these engines. This is no easy task, as countless members of the Thomas fandom have tried to identify these engines, myself included. But as it turns out, none of these engines actually have an exact match. However, since Dalby's illustrations were infamous for errors and inconsistencies, then it's safe to assume that these engines don't look exactly the same as their real-life counterparts. I mean, just take a look at Thomas, or Edward, or Gordon, or James. Notice how none of them look the same as their real-life basis? In fact, Henry and Percy look so different from normal engines that Reverend Audrey couldn't even assign either of them a real-life basis. And don't get me started on the book Tank Engine Thomas again, where the book quite clearly mentions Henry arriving with his train.
How can I run my line properly if Henry is always late? He doesn't realise that the Fat Controller depends on me. And he whistled impatiently. At last Henry came.
But if you look at the illustration, the square buffers, the shape of the tender, come on, that's clearly Gordon! So these engines don't have an exact match in real life, as they're most likely incorrectly illustrated, as the main characters were. So this does mean we can take some liberties regarding their designs. I'm going to present my theory as to what these engines are, but do feel free to submit your own ideas, either in the comments below or to the email in the description. Let's use 98462 as an example. Now, it's never actually been confirmed which way round 98462 and 87546 are, but the general assumption is that this is 98462 and 87546 is the other blue engine, which we will talk about later. 98462 is probably the hardest of all these engines to find the basis for. Each engine only appears in one illustration, and we can use that to determine what they are. But 98462 appears in 3 separate illustrations, and each one depicts them slightly differently. For instance, in the first illustration, which is what most people use for their basis, 98462 is smaller than Gordon, but bigger than Edward. He has inside cylinders and a round dome. However, if we look at the second illustration, this depicts 98462 as being the same size as Gordon rather than smaller. He's shown with outside cylinders instead of inside, and the flat dome instead of round. The illustration also shows 98462 with the same Stanier valve gear and pistons as Gordon has. This is incorrect, as these would not have appeared on locomotives until at least the 1930s. But the book is set between 1922 and 1923. Given that in the second illustration 98462 is a carbon copy of Gordon, I think we can put this down as one of Darby's errors and disregard this illustration completely. Well, the most common theory is that 98462 is a Great Eastern Railway S69 class, later reclassified as a London North Eastern Railway B12, called Alfred. Alfred was sent away in disgrace at some point after Henry was released from the Ballyhoo Tunnel, although what happened afterwards has been debated. Some say he regularly was loaned to the North Western Railway during engine shortages, some say he was preserved, some say he was scrapped. It really does depend on what your opinions of the character are. But if we take his basis, the London North Eastern Railway B12, it actually works quite well as a prototype for 98462. The B12s were significantly bigger than the K2 large seagulls like Edward, but they weren't quite as big as the A1 Pacifics like Gordon, so that's a good start already. The 460 wheel arrangement is one of the 2 potential ones, so that works. The B12s don't have a Belpaire firebox, which you would know if it did because there'd be a big square there, which it doesn't have. The B12 has separate round splashers, much like on 98462, and the rounded dome is the correct sort of shape as well. The only noticeable difference between a B12 and 98462 is that the B12's running board dips at its front splasher, but 98462's running board dips at its smoke box. I did look at other potential locomotives that could be 98462, which did have the correct shape running board. However, they tended to have outside cylinders and steam pipes, both of which are wrong, and the splashers were either square or non-existent, again, both of which are wrong. As I said before, Dalby's illustrations were infamous for having errors, so naturally, the B12 will not be an exact match for 98462. But I do think it's the closest. So, that just leaves the number 98462. I've always wanted to explore the numbers 98462 and 87546 to find out what, if anything, that they actually mean. Chances are Reverend Audrey couldn't find any information about these engines and just gave them random numbers, but I really wanted to see if there was a hidden meaning behind them. I really did look hard for 87546, but it does seem to be just a random number. However, I do think I have an explanation for 98462. The Total Operations Processing System, or TOPS for short, was a system designed in America as a computerized system to replace paper-based logistics. British Railways adopted the system between 1971 and 1973. In order for the TOPS system to work, however, every locomotive needed to be given a new 5-digit number, known as a TOPS number, so they could be added to the system. The first 2 digits were a locomotive's class, whilst the remaining digits identified which member of the class they were. So, for example, if we look at old Stucker, his number is 40125. The first 2 digits are 40, which means he's a class 40. His remaining digits, 125, show that he's the 125th member of the class 40. Now, by 1973, the British Railways only used diesel and electric engines, but there were a number of steam engines that were allowed to run on the main line, with special permission, of course. Now, in order to do this, steam engines would need to be given a TOPS number as well. However, most of them could not use their British Railways number, as that would create duplicates with the diesel engines. So, steam engines were assigned Class 98 under the TOPS system. However, Class 98 was slightly different from the other classes, as the first 2 digits were still the class, 98, but the 3rd digit was actually the engine's power class, and only the last 2 digits were related to their number, specifically the last 2 digits of their British Railways number. That's what I think. I think 98462 is this engine's TOPS number, not its original number. Now, I did look at a list of all the steam engines assigned a Class 98 number, and 98462 hasn't been assigned, which means this engine must be a fictional add-on. Or, this is an engine whose life in the Railway Series universe differed to their real-life counterpart, a bit like how Duck arrived on Sodor a couple of years before his real-life counterpart was scrapped. So, if we look up the number 98462, 98 is of course the class. The middle digit 4 means the locomotive would have had a power class of 4P, 4F, or 4MT. And the last 2 digits, 62, mean that their British Railways number ended in 62. So, for a basis for 98462, we are looking for a tender engine built before 1923, bigger than Edward but smaller than Gordon, has a 442 or a 460 wheel arrangement, power class of 4, inside cylinders, individual round splashers, doesn't have a Belpaire firebox, and has a British Railways number ending in 62. Now for this, I use something called the British Railways database. This has information on pretty much every engine that operated on the railways of the UK between 1948 and 1997. Which does of course mean I might have excluded any locomotives that were fully withdrawn before 1948, but the vast majority of engines in the UK will be on this database. And once I put all the criteria we're looking for into the database, I got one match. Great Eastern Railway 1562. Later, London North Eastern Railway 8562, and then British Railways 61562. And would you look at that? It's a B12. So I think we've found the real Alfred, and possibly the real 98462. Yes, the running board dips in the wrong place, but it meets all the other criteria for 98462. I cannot find any other engines with a power class of 4 with a number ending in 62 that is anything like 98462. So, with that in mind, I will be using Alfred the B12 as 98462. This one's quite interesting. In Middleton's illustrations, the big red engine in Edward's Day Out is the same red engine that appears in the sad story of Henry. This, however, was retconned when Darby made them two different engines. Now, a lot of people have given this engine a 462 wheel arrangement based off of Middleton's illustration in the sad story of Henry. But if you look closely at Middleton's illustrations, the big red engine has a solid running board from front to back. There's no split for the tender, it is a single solid frame. So technically this is a tank engine with a 468 wheel arrangement, which, in case you didn't already know, has never been used on any locomotive design ever. Or at least I've not been able to find any locomotives with that wheel arrangement. So again, we can discard Middleton's illustrations pretty much straight away there. However, Dalby's illustrations aren't much help. It's unclear what the wheel arrangement is because it's impossible to tell if the front wheel is a leading wheel or a driving wheel. If it's a leading wheel, then we're looking for a 260 or a 280. But if it's a driving wheel, then we're looking for an 080. Either way, we're looking for an engine with inside cylinders, a round dome, and no splashers. And immediately we run into a problem, because there aren't any engines with a 260, a 280, or an 080 wheel arrangement with inside cylinders. So, much like 98462, the big red engine suffers from illustration errors, and therefore their bases will differ slightly from the illustration. But the question still remains, what is the best basis for the big red engine? Well, I've come across two different theories for that. The first theory is that the big red engine is a London, Brighton and South Coast Railway K-class called Aled Greedy. Goodness knows where they got that name from. Anyway, apart from the cylinders, this is actually a pretty good match. It's about the same sort of size as the LNER B12, which I'm using for 98462, and they do appear to be the same size in the illustration, so that works. Although I'm not particularly fond of the name Aled Greedy. For some reason it just doesn't sound quite right. Now, as it happens, I have no idea what on earth that name means, so I decided to try and find out. Turns out Aled is another form of Alfred, which is the name I've assigned to 98462. So even if I use the London, Brighton and South Coast K-class, I won't be using the name Aled Greedy. The other potential theory actually comes from the TV series. In the series 19 episode, Who's Geoffrey?, Thomas has a big accident at Brendam Docks and blames her on a non-existent engine called Geoffrey. Train's model creator, Sodor Workshops, took Thomas's various descriptions and turned them into a train's model, which bears a striking resemblance to the big red engine. Admittedly, Geoffrey lacks the dip at the front of his running board, but apart from that, it is a good fit. Having said that, though, I do feel Geoffrey's basis is a bit on the big side. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway K-class, but call the engine Geoffrey, as technically speaking, one of these engines painted in red still fits Thomas's description of the character. So, now we will move on to 87546. Since I've already discarded Middleton's illustrations when searching for a potential basis for 98462 and the big red engine, I will disregard them for 87546 by default. The number is also of no use to us, as no engine in the UK has ever carried this number. In fact, having had a quick look through the numbers for British Rail steam engines, none of the numbers got anywhere close to 87546, so it can't be a fictional add-on either. So then I decided to look around and see if it was a number for an engine from another country. And what did I find? Absolutely nothing. I checked the steam engine rosters for over 20 different countries, and none of them had any engines with a suitable number. So my next assumption was maybe the number was a clerical error. So I started looking at locomotives whose numbers were 4 out of the 5 digits in the correct order. And again, absolutely nothing. It really does look as though 87546 is a completely random number. So, since the number is of no help to us whatsoever, I will be looking for a suitable basis for 87546 based solely on their appearance. In a similar situation to the Big Red engine, it's almost impossible to tell if 87546's second wheel is a driving wheel or a trailing wheel. Although, upon close examination, it seems the second wheel is most likely a driving wheel. However, it does seem that 87546 is smaller than the Big Red engine in this illustration, which might explain why some fans have headcanoned 87546 as a large tank engine. But again, the illustration makes it nearly impossible to tell. Now, the book clearly states Edward was the smallest engine in the shed.
Once upon a time there was a little engine called Edward. He lived in a shed with 5 other engines. They were all bigger than Edward and boasted about it.
So, if 87546 is a tank engine, it'd have to be a very large tank engine, but with side tanks small enough to leave the boiler partially exposed. So we're looking for an engine with 2 leading wheels, outside cylinders, and is bigger than Edward. It need to be smaller than the Big Red engine if it's a tender engine, or about the same size as the Big Red engine if it's a tank engine. Now I started by looking through potential tender engines that would fit the basis, and I found absolutely nothing. I then started looking at tank engines, and I did find a match. A Great Western Railway 4200 class. This, in my opinion, is the best fit based on 87546's appearance, and that is the theory I'm going to go with. Now, originally I assumed that this green engine was Henry. In fact, everybody assumed this green engine was Henry. Even Dalby, who illustrated the book, which might explain why this engine looks so much like Henry. However, this illustration is from the story Edward's Day Out. It has since been confirmed that this takes place between the events of the sad story of Henry in 1922 and Edward, Gordon and Henry in 1923, which means at this point Henry should still be bricked up in the tunnel. But if Henry's in the tunnel, who is this mysterious green engine? Now, a lot of people have put forward their suggestions for this engine, and the bases they've gone with are about the same sort of size as 98462 or the Big Red engine. The problem is this green engine is shown to be much larger than them. In fact, they look to be about the same size as Gordon, which means they must be a Pacific type locomotive, a 462. That in itself is a bit of a problem, as Gordon was the first successful Pacific locomotive built in the UK. Yes, technically Henry was built first, but he was a miserable failure. and in fact was so terrible he had to be rebuilt. I was stumped, really, as what to do with this engine. I thought I would have to create another prototype like Henry to try and explain who this engine was. But that's when I realised there already is one, or was. Great Western Railway's number 111, more commonly known as the Great Bear. This was the first specific type locomotive built in the UK, and as you probably guessed, it was a total failure. The intention of this locomotive was to be the biggest and best locomotive built by the Great Western Railway to be used as their flagship locomotive. In reality, though, the Great Bear turned out to be their biggest public embarrassment. Interestingly, the Great Bear was withdrawn from service in 1924 for major repairs. However, since it had been such a disaster, the decision was made to rebuild it into a more conventional locomotive design, specifically a Great Western Railway Castle class. I can't help but wonder if the Great Bear inspired Henry's story, given how similar their backstories seem to be. But looking at it, I'd say the Great Bear is the perfect fit to be this green engine. They were built back in 1908 and they weren't rebuilt until 1924, just a few months after the events of Edward's Day Out, so the timeline fits. They're also pretty big, they were about the same sort of size as Gordon, so that fits as well. And being a Great Western engine, it also explains why it's painted green. There is just one problem with using the Great Bear. The Great Western Railway already knew that the Great Bear was a disaster not long after it was built back in 1908. The events of Edward's Day Out take place in 1923. So, why would the Great Western Railway send a locomotive that they had known for 15 years at this point was a total disaster? I couldn't actually think of an explanation. But then I found this illustration made by Rexeljet, and he has come up with a theory to explain the Great Bear's presence. The original controller of the North Western Railway, Sir Topham Hatt, was very close friends with a gentleman called Sir William Stanier, best known for being the chief mechanical engineer of the London, Midland and Scottish Railway. In fact, it was Stanier that had Henry rebuilt at Crewe after his accident with the Flying Kipper. It is said that Topham and Stanier became friends at Swindon Works on the Great Western Railway, where they did an apprenticeship together. During the 1920s, Stanier was still at Swindon Works and had worked his way up to manager of the workshops. Rexeljet's theory is that whilst Henry was in the tunnel, Stanier agreed to send an engine to the North Western Railway to help, most likely one of their newly built Castle-class engines. However, there was a bit of a mix-up and Stanier accidentally sent the Great Bear instead, which, as you might expect, was a total disaster, and so was sent back to Swindon almost immediately. Stanier apologised for his mistake and owed Sir Topham Hatt a big favour. This might explain why Sir Topham Hatt sent Henry to Crewe to be rebuilt, as he was calling in that favour. As I said earlier, Dalby illustrated the red engines as two different engines. We've already gone over the first one. The second one, however, looks like a carbon copy of James. The only difference is this engine has red wheels, whilst James's wheels are black. And of course, this illustration shows the engine with a red dome compared to James's gold or brass dome. I have seen some members of the fandom try and find an alternative basis for this engine, but since this engine is identical to James, I'm inclined to stick with the theory that they are brothers, possibly even twins. I also believe this engine appears in the story Henry and the Elephant from the book Troublesome Engines. In this story, a circus comes to Sodor and all of the engines want to be chosen to pull the special circus train. Henry and Gordon are not allowed to pull the circus train because of their bad attitude. The same bad attitude that eventually leads them to going on strike. Now, the book says James is the one who gets to pull the circus train, and he is clearly illustrated in the book. However, his attitude was just as bad as Henry and Gordon's. And we know this because when Henry and Gordon went on strike, James went on strike too. This implies that it was the other red engine that pulled the circus train and not James, but was incorrectly illustrated as James because the two are almost identical, and that might also explain why Audrey said it was James. Somebody else who couldn't tell them apart probably told him it was James and he didn't bother to check. But even if you don't think this is the red engine, they do make at least one more appearance in the story Henry Sneeze from the book Henry the Green Engine. In one illustration there is a red engine that looks exactly the same as James, but James has black wheels and this engine's wheels are clearly red, so it must be the red engine. Since this took place in 1935, this proves that this engine was still on Sodor in 1935, 12 years after all the other engines from the three railway engines had either been purchased or sent back home. This means that the other red engine must have been good enough for Sir Topham Hatt to keep him around. However, in universe, Reverend Audrey first visited Sodor in 1942, and by this point, the red engine was no longer on Sodor. Otherwise, he probably would have been mentioned by name in the books. So, if this engine was good enough for the North Western Railway to purchase them, and they were still around in the mid-30s, how could they have left Sodor before Audrey's first visit in 1942? Well, to be honest, I don't know. I was stumped. But luckily, Wild Nor'Westers come up with a potential theory. In his series, Sodor the Early Years, he has theorised that the red engine was successfully purchased by the North Western Railway and ran on the railway for many years. However, at the start of the Second World War, the War Department demanded that the North Western Railway give them one of their engines on loan until the war was over. And the red engine was the engine they took. The theory goes that the red engine was pulling a munitions train that then caught fire. They were able to get the burning explosives away from the nearest town, but were not able to get away themselves and were destroyed in the subsequent explosion. This actually mirrors a very similar event that occurred in Soham in 1944, when the first wagon on a train carrying explosives caught fire. The van was uncoupled and moved away from the rest of the train before it exploded. The train's fireman, James Nighthall, and the station's signalman, Frank Bridges, were both killed in the subsequent explosion, whilst driver Benjamin Gimbert was severely injured, and the station itself was completely destroyed. Gimbert and Nighthall were both awarded the George Cross Medal for their actions, as it is believed that without their intervention, the entire train, including 51 wagons filled with explosives, could have exploded and would have destroyed half the town. I do believe this explanation works quite well. Most of the engines that have been sent away were sent away for bad behaviour. It's a story that's been used countless times, particularly with diesel, and is getting a bit boring. Whereas having somebody you don't talk about because they were lost in a tragic incident is far more interesting than not talking about someone because they were badly behaved. It also explains how the engine could have outlasted the other loaned engines from the 1920s, but still left Sodor before 1942. The only difficulty with this engine is their name. I've heard several names be suggested for this engine, including Winston, Red Max, Eagle, and a few others. And to be honest, I'm not sure which name to go for. I do have a favourite, but I'm intrigued to hear what you think. Let me know what you think the red engine should be called. Now, whilst we're looking at the book The Three Railway Engines, there is one more character we must discuss. Sir Topham Hatt. Now, in the Railway series, and the UK dub of the TV series, Sir Topham Hatt is known as the Fat Controller. However, he did not gain this nickname until the formation of British Railways in 1948. Prior to that, his nickname was the Fat Director, which he gained upon becoming General Manager in 1923. However, a Fat Director was mentioned in the sad story of Henry, which takes place a year prior in 1922. So if Sir Topham Hatt did not become Fat Director until 1923, the Fat Director in the sad story of Henry must be someone else. The book even hints at this by referring to them as a Fat Director rather than the Fat Director.
A fat director who was on the train. A fat director. A fat director.
It's also worth mentioning that in this story, the Fat Director acts terribly out of character. We know Sir Topham Hatt is a very firm individual, but he's also fair. He's also very sensible. But in the sad story of Henry, the Fat Director is a bit of an idiot. Normally, when an engine or something else is blocking the line, your priority is to remove the blockage. His solution is to forget about the blockage and dig an entire new tunnel next to the existing one. That's a very stupid, not to mention expensive, solution to the problem. It's also shown that the Fat Director would not help in pulling or pushing the train out of the tunnel. However, since Sir Topham Hatt trained as an engineer and prior to becoming the railway's general manager he was their chief mechanical engineer, we know he has no problems getting dirty or doing a bit of hard work. So it is safe to assume that this Fat Director is not the Fat Director. But if that's the case, then who is he? Who is this mysterious Fat Director? Well, I have a theory about that. When Sir Topham Hatt retired, the nickname Fat Controller was inherited by his son Charles, and then by his grandson Stephen, and currently resides with his great-grandson Richard. So this is quite clearly a family-run business with an inherited nickname. Although less common these days, back when the North Western Railway was first built, it was still common practice for the eldest son in the family to take up the same profession as their father. Now, Topham trained as a railway engineer and has worked for the railway since he built Coffee Pot No. 1 for the Tidmouth, Knapford and Elsbridge Light Railway. So, if we put two and two together, the most likely explanation is that the Fat Director from the sad story of Henry is most likely Sir Topham Hatt's father. Now, one other thing I did discover was that in some episodes of the TV series, Sir Topham Hatt is called Bertram instead. Now, back when Sir Topham Hatt was a boy, it was common to refer to boys by their father's name or their father's nickname, usually by putting the word little in front of it. So if people referred to Sir Topham Hatt as Bertram, this implies his father's name was Bertram. This might also explain why Topham was called Topham, as it could either be his father's nickname or it could be in some way related to his father's nickname. And speaking of inheriting nicknames, it could explain why both Sir Topham and his father were both called the Fat Director. So that is the theory I'm going with. But the Fat Director from the sad story of Henry is most likely Sir Bertram Hatt, father of Sir Topham Hatt. Right, let's move on to another book, specifically Thomas the Tank Engine. Now, in two illustrations in this book, we can see some small blue engines. The second illustration clearly showing an 060 tender engine. Now, I've seen some people try and explain these as being two separate engines, but looking at the engines more closely, particularly in Payne's illustrations, I'm tempted to say they are the same engine. But what exactly is this engine? Well, we're looking for a small 060 tender engine with a dome somewhere near the middle of the boiler. Now, as it happens, it is a perfect match for this engine, the London North Eastern Railway J38. There's just one problem with that. The J38s weren't built until 1926, 2 years after this engine first appeared in Thomas and Gordon. No other engine looks exactly the same as this engine, so chances are it is an illustration error. And this time I can't even blame Dalby, because his illustrations are almost identical to original Payne's illustrations. But if a J38 is out of the question, what is the next best fit? Well, to be honest, any of the older LNER J-class locomotives. It could be a J1, a J4, a J5, a J6, a J20, J22, a J37, and a couple others I've not actually mentioned. I specifically have chosen the J6 as I believe it is the closest fit. And looking at this illustration by Rexeljet, it seems I'm not the only one who thinks the J6 is the best fit. So this is what I'm going to stick with. Now we're on to the book James the Red Engine. In two illustrations of the story Troublesome Trucks, there is a blue tank engine that is shunting James's trucks for him. Although admittedly both illustrations depict this engine as being slightly different in appearance, yet more evidence of Dalby's inability to remain consistent. You'll also notice his engine bears a striking resemblance to Thomas, which is why in the TV series, Thomas took the role of his character. Worse still is that Christopher Awdry rewrote the story for an annual book, and it was re-illustrated by Clive Spong, who made the engine look completely different again. However, I'm going to disregard all of these illustrations, as Christopher Awdry once stated, the engine from this story is most likely one of the Wordsworth and Sodor tank engines, and in my opinion it's most likely going to be number 4, and so that is the theory I'm going with. Okay, let's quickly jump all the way to the book Henry the Green Engine, specifically the story Gordon's Whistle, set in 1935. Now, as Henry returns to Sodor following his rebuild, we can see a mysterious blue engine passing by the shed, most likely the engine that took over Henry's work on their way back to the mainland. Now, some fans have speculated this might actually be Edward. I don't agree. First of all, this engine is completely the wrong shape to be Edward, and secondly, if Edward was in this scene, he would most likely be in the shed with the other engines. Now, the other leading theory, and the one that I'm going with, is that this engine is actually 98462. As many fans have speculated that after his departure back in 1923, 98462 was regularly loaned to the North Western Railway when there weren't any other engines available. Similar to how the TV series always used diesel when there wasn't another engine available. I am tempted to go ahead and just say that This is 98462, but let me know what you think. Is this 98462, or do you think it's a different engine altogether? Right, jumping ahead again, this time to the book The 8 Famous Engines. In the story, Gordon Goes Foreign, we can see an engine that is derailed on its way to collect the express. But who is it? Well, some have actually speculated that this is the Big City engine, also known as Patriot, from the start of the story. However, Patriot clearly has smoke deflectors, whereas this derailed engine doesn't. So this rules out Patriot's bases, the Patriot class, but it also rules out the Royal Scot class and the unstreamlined Coronation class, as by this point they primarily had smoke deflectors too. This leaves the LMS's Princess Royal class as the only other potential express engine, as they weren't fitted with smoke deflectors. Although admittedly, the derailed engine does look a bit small to be a Princess Royal class. But given how far off they are in the distance, it's not that easy to tell. It could possibly be a smaller engine, but given this is meant to be a non-stop express running from Barrow-in-Furness all the way to London, I think the Princess Royal is most likely the best fit, and therefore that is the theory I'm going to use. Sticking with the 8 famous engines for a moment, by this point the North Western Railway had purchased 8 engines of its own: Thomas, Edward, Henry, Gordon, James, Percy, Toby and Duck. Now the last story of this book shows the 8 engines going to the mainland for an exhibition. Meanwhile, 7 engines from the mainland come to Sodor to take care of their work whilst they are away. Now the first thing to point out is that the North Western Railway has 8 engines, but there were only 7 replacements, which means 1 engine didn't have a replacement. This is most likely going to be Toby, as Toby works up in the quarry, and it's quite likely that whilst Toby was away, the quarry would take the opportunity to close down for blasting. We also know that Thomas and Percy's replacements were Ginty and Pug respectively. But what about the others? What engines replaced Edward, Henry, Gordon, James and Duck? Now, I was originally planning to make all of these engines from British Railways Midland region, formerly the LMS Railway. However, since the North Western Railway has acquired engines from all across the UK, I will consider engines from British Railways' other regions as well. And since this story is set in 1956, I can consider BR standard classes as well. Audrey never gave any details about who these engines are, and they're hardly visible in their only illustration, which means you have a bit of a blank slate to work with. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each character and potential locomotives that could be used as their replacement whilst they are on the mainland. And what I want you to do is go to the link in the description below and vote for which basis you think best suits each character's replacement. Then whichever engines get the most votes will be the engines I use. So first of all we have Edward. His replacement will be mainly looking after the Brendan branch line, but might also be working as a banker. So we're looking for a small tender engine or possibly even a large tank engine. Now the most likely candidates for this would be the British Railway Standard Class 2, either the tender engine variant or the tank engine variant. Other potential candidates include any of the Great Western Railway's Prairie tank engines, the LMS Fowler 2P, the IVAT 2MT tender engine, the IVAT 2MT tank engine, the Southern Railway Q class, and the Hunslet Austerity saddle tanks. Next we have Henry. His replacement needs to be a large mixed traffic engine suitable for mainline trains. Now the natural choice would be an LMS Stanier Class 5, more commonly known as a Black 5, as that was the basis for Henry's rebuild. Alternatively, it could be British Railways Standard Class 5, which was almost identical to the Black 5s. Other potential candidates include the Great Western Railway's Castle, Manor and Hall classes, the LMS Patriot class, the LNER's B1, B12, B17 and V2 classes, and the Southern Railway's West Country or Battle of Britain class and the Q1 class. So, then we have Gordon. His replacement needs to be a powerful mainline express engine. Now, perhaps the best choice for this would be the Patriot engine Gordon was arguing with in the story Gordon Goes Foreign. I do think that would be quite funny. Other potential candidates include the Great Western Railway's King and Castle classes, the LMS Royal Scot, Princess Royal and Coronation classes, the LNER's A1 and A3 Pacifics, and the Southern Railway's Lord Nelson and Merchant Navy classes. Moving on to James. His replacement needs to be a medium-sized traffic engine. The most sensible choice would most likely be a British Railway Standard Class 3, although having said that, this is highly unlikely. Other candidates include the Great Western Railway 2251 class, the Caledonian Railway 812 and 652 classes, the London North Eastern Railway B12, K1 and the majority of their J classes, and the Southern Railway Q class. Finally, we have Duck, and his replacement would be a small tank engine suitable for shunting at a big station. The most likely candidate would actually be an Austerity 060 saddle tank. However, it could also have been any of the Great Western Railway's pannier tanks, a London North Eastern Railway J50 or J51, or the Southern Railway USA class. And actually, now that I think about it, maybe even an early diesel. No, not a diesel, that wouldn't work. Let's stick with the steam engines. So those are my candidates for the various engines replacements whilst they're away on the mainland. Don't forget to vote on which ones you think are best by clicking that link in the description below. Moving on now to the book Duck and the Diesel Engines, which contains two mysterious engines in the story A Close Shave. One engine is pulling the train that breaks free and chases Duck down the main line, and the other is the one that Duck narrowly avoided crashing into. Now, we don't actually see the first engine, and some have even assumed it is Edward. After all, it was Edward pulling this train in the TV series. Although personally I feel Edward is more likely to be on his branch line at that time. So I don't think it's Edward. But it can't be Henry, Gordon or James either, because at this point they are still upset with Duck because of the lies Diesel has been telling. So this engine is a complete mystery, another blank slate. So you can use pretty much any engine you like to fulfill this role. As it stands, I haven't actually decided on an engine to fulfill this role, I'm still working on that. What I have figured out, though, is the other engine in this book. The second engine does actually appear in an illustration, but they are very small and very blurry. From a distance, it's nearly impossible to tell what this engine is, or even what colour it's supposed to be. It looks like it might be a green steam engine, but if we zoom in properly, we can see the engine is actually blue and quite large. Steam engines on the mainland were all painted black or green at this point, so this must be a Sodor engine. Now then, a big blue Sodor engine. This must be Gordon. It's got to be. Okay, so for our next theory, we need to go all the way ahead to branch line engines, specifically to look at Daisy, the diesel rail car. Now, whilst Reverend Audrey, the creator of the series, was a big fan of real-life trains, he also had a big passion for model railways, and even went as far as making a model layout of Farker Station. He also bought and modified a variety of models to resemble the characters from his stories, including Thomas, Percy, Toby, and Duck. Each character's model was modified so that they resemble their respective character as closely as possible. Therefore, it's safe to assume that how Audrey depicted his models is how the characters were supposed to look like in the books. In fact, it was Audrey's model of Duck that led to the invention of that character. Now, by looking at Audrey's collection of models, they are all near identical to how they appear in the books. There is, however, a noticeable exception, and that is Daisy, the diesel rail car. Interesting fact about Daisy is that Reverend Audrey always intended for Daisy to be a British Railways 101 class diesel rail car. The problem is, Metro Camel, the people that built the class 101s, only ever built diesel multiple units. They did not build a class 101 rail car, which makes Daisy one of a kind. This stems back to Audrey's model for Daisy, where he acquired a 101 class diesel multiple unit, cut the cab off the second unit, and put it on the front unit to make a diesel rail car. However, if you will notice, Daisy has a completely green front, but her model depicts her with a yellow mask, similar to that seen on Bear or Bogo. Now, since Audrey's models are meant to be accurate depictions of the characters, this implies that Daisy is supposed to have the yellow mask in the Railway Series universe, even though she's not illustrated with one. This of course means that whilst Daisy's illustrated to look like this, she's supposed to look more like this. And it's not just Daisy. Mavis's model is also depicted with a yellow front, but in the books, she's illustrated with a grey face. Now, using the same logic we used on Daisy, it's safe to assume that whilst Mavis was illustrated like this, she actually looks more like this. Next up is the book Stephanie the Bluebell Engine. In this book we are introduced to an unnamed Class 40 diesel, numbered D4711. Now we know this is a fictional number because D4711 was never assigned to a real engine, and if it was, it would have been a shunting engine. The Class 40s were actually named between D200 and D399. So what could D4711's real number be? Well, the TV series has suggested that the engine's real number is D261. Although unconfirmed, it is believed that D4711 and D261 are meant to be the same character, seeing as they share exactly the same role in Stephanie's story. Now, as it happens, D261 was a real Class 40 diesel engine. The only problem is the TV series gave D261 an English accent, but the real D261 spent most of its working life in Edinburgh. That's right, everyone, D261 is Scottish. Now, this wouldn't be out of the question, as we've already had Scottish characters in the Railway series, like Donald, Douglas, and even Duncan. So D4711 could quite easily be Scottish, and in a similar way to Duncan, you wouldn't be able to tell he was Scottish based on how the books were written. You can tell Donald and Douglas are Scottish, because all their lines are written in Scots. But since Duncan's lines are written in English, you have no way of knowing he's supposed to have a Scottish accent, and the same could apply to D4711. This is of course assuming, but D4711 and D261 are the same engine, of course. I certainly think they are, and I think giving him a Scottish accent would be quite funny. Interestingly enough, many people believe that D4711, or D261, whatever you want to go with, is the engine that caught Oliver trying to escape to Sodor with Douglas in the story Escape from the book Enterprising Engines. This, of course, is because D261 was the engine that caught Oliver in the My Thomas Story Library book. It's unlikely that this was D261 in the Railway series, but it is entirely possible. Now we're going to take a pretty big leap forward all the way to one of Christopher's books, Wilbert the Forest Engine. Now in this book, the Fat Controller at the time, Sir Stephen Topham Hatt, wanted to trial Wilbert on the North Western Railway. If the trial went well, he knew where to get another Hunslet Austerity saddle tank like Wilbert and would purchase them for the railway. But who is this engine? Well, the most popular theory is that the Austerity engine is called Sheffield, a character created by Wild Nor'Wester. He is called Sheffield because he used to work at a steelworks based in Sheffield. He then moved to a heritage railway before eventually being purchased by the North Western Railway. This theory also seems to imply that Sheffield is meant to be 16. There is just one problem with that. Sodor Island Models has been doing research to try and find the true identities of various Railway series characters like Duck, Diesel, and even the Big City Engine. Recently, he's actually found the true identity of 16. However, 16 didn't work in Sheffield. He actually worked in Scunthorpe. Now, it's also said the Austerity engine was purchased from a heritage railway, but in real life, 16 was actually scrapped. Although having said that, Toby, Duck, and Oliver were all based on real engines that have since been scrapped, so that doesn't mean much. I do like the idea of the Austerity engine being 16, but since 16 worked in Scunthorpe, the name Sheffield doesn't work. Although having said that, Scunthorpe's an even worse name for a locomotive. Now again, I haven't actually come up with a name for this engine yet, and let me just stop right there. Since I started making this video, Christopher Awdry has published a 20th anniversary edition of the book Sodor Reading Between the Lines. In this book, it confirms that the Austerity engine, purchased by Sir Stephen Topham Hatt, was named Walter and was painted black. Further information has been provided in Richard Awdry's lecture Sodor in 2025. Walter was purchased to extend the Little Western branch line from Alsborough up to Harwick to serve a nuclear power station being built near Drogon y Clagan. So, since this theory has been solved, I think we can strike it off the list. Having said that, however, there is no information we've been given thus far that suggests Walter can't be 16. So, whilst the Austerity engine definitely can't be Sheffield, because it is obviously Walter, the idea that the Austerity engine is 16 is still a very valid possibility. We'll just have to wait and see if the Audreys give us any more information about Walter. Anyway, back to the video. Okay, so we have one last character to identify, and that is Barry. Now, for those of you who don't know, Barry was a character created by Christopher Audrey as part of a book he was going to call Barry the Rescue Engine. However, at the time, the creators of the Thomas and Friends TV series had a shortage of Thomas-focused stories to adapt. And at that time, they were required that every episode they made was based on a story written by either Christopher or his father. Therefore, Christopher's publisher rejected his ideas for Barry the Rescue Engine and instead insisted he wrote a Thomas-focused book instead. Based on the timeline, this is most likely more about Thomas the Tank Engine, which has gone down with the Railway series as generally being considered the worst Railway series book ever written. And it's not hard to see why, but that's a discussion for another day. However, Christopher was still very keen to work on Barry, having said that Barry is dead, but not yet buried. But just who is Barry exactly? Well, we'll start with their name. Barry is called Barry because he was rescued from Woodham Brothers Scrapyard, more commonly known as Barry Island Scrapyard, in Barry, in Wales. Barry is a 2MT, a Class 2 mixed traffic engine. Now, many speculated that he was the British Railways 2MT tender engine. However, Christopher's son Richard has since confirmed that Barry was actually an LMS Class 2, not a British Railways one, and crucially was a tank engine, not a tender engine. Unfortunately though, that is all we know about Barry. The rest will have to be guesswork. Now, it was never actually mentioned whether Barry was a permanent member of the North Western Railway fleet, or if he was an engine restored on Sodor before moving to a heritage railway on the mainland. The latter seems to be more plausible and seems to be the most commonly accepted theory amongst fans. Now, I must stress this is just a theory, but if it is true, we can narrow Barry down to a single engine. Only 4 of the LMS's IVAT Class 2 mixed traffic tank engines have been preserved: 41241, 41298, 41312 and 41313. Of these 4 engines, only 2 of them were sent to Barry Island Scrapyard, 41312 and 41313, so we can rule out the other 2. 41313 lives and has done for many years on the Isle of Wight Steam Railway, along with 41298. However, since Barry lives on the mainland, this means he's most likely 41312, currently residing at the Mid-Hants Railway, also known as the Watercress Line, in Hampshire. Having looked at the details of this engine and comparing them to the few things we do know about Barry, this actually works quite well. 41312 arrived at Barry Island Scrapyard in 1967 and stayed there until 1974, when it was successfully saved by a member of the Caerphilly Railway Society in Caerphilly in Wales. There is no information about what happened to 41312 until it was sold to a new owner in 1985, when it moved to the Midlands Railway. That is an 11-year time gap that fits with the time Barry the rescue engine was most likely meant to be set. Now, during this time, the Caerphilly Railway Society was based at the old Caerphilly Locomotive Department near Caerphilly Station, and they used this site to restore steam engines. But the Society faced several difficulties trying to restore locomotives here, mostly due to regular acts of vandalism that occurred on site, which eventually forced them to close in the 90s and move to the how do you pronounce this? I'm going to have a stab at this and say it's the Gwilly Railway, but if I've got any Welsh viewers who'd like to tell me how to pronounce it properly, then please do. Anyway, so if 41312 is Barry, then it's possible they were sent to the island of Sodor to be restored at the safety of Crovan's Gate, without the threat of vandalism he would have faced at Caerphilly. Or alternatively, 41312 could have arrived at Caerphilly in such a poor state he was beyond the capabilities of the Society at that time, and was sent to the more experienced engineers at Crovan's Gate Works. Personally, I believe it could be a bit of both. So that is my theory regarding Barry the rescue engine. And I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. This has actually gone on far longer than I was expecting it to, but as I said at the beginning, I wanted to do this properly, and sometimes that means putting in a lot more effort than you originally intended to. Don't forget to share your opinions. You can vote on some of the things we discussed so far by clicking that link in the description, or you can leave your suggestions in the comments. Alternatively, you can send your ideas for potential characters to the email address, also found in the description below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you again soon.